Welcome back to the We've All Been There podcast. I am one of the pastors here at Lifegate Church, and I get to do this awesome podcast with my pastor, your pastor, Pastor Chad Benson.
What's up,
Pastor,
P-Max? How are you?
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, man?
Man, I'm doing great. Just glad to be back.
I know, man. We're getting on a roll now.
Come
We're back.
on.
Season 3. We've all been there podcast. Come on,
Let's
we're on a
go.
roll. Yes.
Let's go.
And it's just you and me today.
I know.
We've
man.
been having guests this last couple
I know.
of times.
That's been fun to have people
It
around
has
with us
been.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've had some good ones, man.
Yeah.
Peter and David. Awesome stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this last time, Peter, he schooled us, told us what it's like to be unhealthy.
Come on.
Talked about how to get more healthy
Yeah.
in our emotions and our relationships and in our leadership and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It inspired me so much. I was like, we need to talk more about that.
Absolutely.
I think we could talk about this subject of leadership health for a long, long time.
Yes.
And so that's what we're going to kind of dive into this time. We're talking about, last time we said we've all been unhealthy.
That's right.
This time we're going to talk about we've all been healthy.
Yeah.
We're going to learn a little bit about what it means
Yeah.
to be healthy in leadership.
Yeah. And that episode was a pretty long episode,
Yeah.
and we talked a lot off camera
Yeah.
about a lot of stuff.
We did.
And maybe we should make like a Patreon.
We might should. Yeah.
like a-
Everybody get on there and subscribe
behind
to
the scenes.
Patreon.
But yeah, I'm super excited about this series because we're talking about being healthy, and we all know that healthy is more than just in one area, you
Yeah.
know. And so we're going to actually make this into a 4-part series.
4
and just,
parts.
Come on, somebody.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a breakdown of just different ways to be healthy. You know, it's going to touch every part of our life, our mind, our body, our spirit, our emotions. And so I'm super excited to be talking about all those areas. And when I think about being healthy, I know I look back recently on our family trip to Honduras, Guatemala. And we had this group text with the family called Death to Lonjas.
Oh.
And you may not know
Death
what
to
that
what?
word.
Say it again.
Lonjas.
Lonjas?
Killed it, yeah.
That's it, right?
Yeah. And so for our non-Spanish speakers,
Which is me.
yeah, exactly. For our non-Spanish speakers, the word lonjas means rolls.
Oh, okay.
So death to our rolls.
Yes.
And so we were on a mission to lose as much weight as possible, to look as good as possible, because whenever you go and see your Spanish family members, it's just something that it just happens everywhere. But they are just savage. They just let you know that you are not skinny, okay? So, yeah, they were pretty mean. Thankfully, we all did a good job of losing weight, and so we didn't get any comments from
There you
anybody,
go.
but thankfully we did our part. So, what about you? Have you ever
So they want to fatten you up with lots of
No,
good
yeah,
Latino
that's the
food
truth.
and
Oh, my
then make
goodness.
fun of you because you gained weight. What's
It's
up
true.
with that?
It's
Yeah.
true. No, seriously, that's happened. What about you? Have you ever had any moments where you've had to really focus on
Yeah,
getting physically
man.
healthy?
I've gone up and down over the years. You know,
Yeah.
there's
But
been
you're
times
doing
I've
great right
been-
now.
I've been doing good.
You're killing
lately.
it.
Yeah, I was looking at, we post those reels of old podcasts, and I was like, whoa, man, look, I've lost some
Yup.
weight. Look at that.
Yup.
That's awesome. But I've had lots of times when I've done that. I can remember it was about 10 years ago or so. Well, I'll back up a little bit. When Amber was pregnant with Briley, I gained weight with her. We just, I just had a bowl of ice cream every night and whatever. And then she got pregnant with Addie really soon after Briley was born. She was only 6 months old when we found out we were having another baby. That's a whole nother podcast right there. But anyway.
What would that be called?
I don't know. Well, we've all been overwhelmed. That would probably be what it feels
Okay,
like.
I like
But
that.
anyway, I was like, man, I can't gain weight again.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I actually lost weight while Amber was pregnant with Addie. Kept it off pretty good. And then gradually it kind of comes back and you get stressed and things like that. And then I think it was about 2013 or 14. We had this lady that went to our church that she worked for Beachbody. If you ever seen P90X and
Yes,
stuff like
I
that.
have.
And she was always trying to get us to do stuff. Super sweet lady.
Yeah.
And never pushy, but she was always like, oh, you should do this program. So one day she came in and she was like, here, I'm giving you these videos for P90X if you'll do it. So me and a buddy did it together all 90 days. We did every single day, 90
You had
days in a
rock
row.
hard abs.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I did lose some weight and got pretty fit. And then I kept doing it for about 2 more years and stayed pretty fit. And
Okay.
then we found out we were having another baby. Easton came along and I'd never gained a whole lot back, but my workout schedule kind of got messed up. So yeah, I mean, I think everybody wants to be healthy, especially when you're talking about physical health. You're watching social media. Probably while you're watching this video on YouTube, you probably seen an ad from that V-Shred guy. He's like every other ad and whatever. And you go to the grocery store and the diet aisle is just filled with all kinds of health food, and the gyms and the workout centers and all that kind of stuff. And we put a ton of emphasis on our physical health. And it's super important to be healthy in our bodies. But I think it's also just as important, maybe even more important, to be healthy in our spirit and in our emotions and our leadership. It makes me think of what Paul says in 1 Timothy 4:8 when he says physical training has some value, but godliness has value in all things, and holding a promise for both the present life and life to come. And so physical health is important because it does help us in this life, but other kinds of health are not just about this life, but they're about the life to come. And so I definitely want to be physically healthy. But man, I've learned some things over the years about how to be healthy in other areas of my life too. And it probably comes and goes too, just like physical health does, but healthy in things like being a healthy husband, a healthy father, a healthy pastor, and a healthy leader, a friend or person. And so I know in these areas, I told you stories about getting unhealthy physically, but I've had times when I was unhealthy in those areas too. I mean, I remember when I was young in ministry, I went through some unhealthy times in my emotional health. I remember I've probably said it before on the podcast. I was 24 when I became a lead pastor, and it was the church that I mostly grew up in. That my parents were the founding pastors, and so I was pretty young and immature to be a lead pastor. I mean, I must have been somewhat mature for a 24-year-old for them to even select me to be the pastor, but I was still 24. And I had all these anxieties and all these insecurities and all these fears. And I remember really going through some tough days in those first couple of years of being a lead pastor. And now that when I look back, I realize that many of those difficult things that we went through had to do with the fact that I didn't even know how to live in a healthy way emotionally, let alone lead in a healthy way emotionally. I just had not learned how to be healthy in my emotions. And so I couldn't even live that way, let alone lead a church in that way. And I learned some things. I can remember more recently, just a few years ago in 2021, after everything that happened in 2020 and after, the pandemic was still going, but after we kind of came through that initial phase of it and the shock of that and the trauma of that really as a pastor. And I remember though, at the beginning, like I was super hopeful. I was like, well, we're going to get through this. And I kept thinking, hey, by this date, it'll all come back, or by this date, it'll all come back. I remember I had kind of in my mind 2021, by Easter, we're going to be back. And then Easter came and it went, and we weren't back, and the church was still not what it was before all of that happened. And I just remember I hit a wall, and I think maybe for the first time really in my life, I was truly depressed. Found out later through my counselor that what I was really dealing with was grief and loss. And fortunately, I didn't have anybody that passed away due to the pandemic, but anybody that I was really close to. But we'd lost a lot in the ministry that we're doing in the church and things like that. And so, and I can remember I barely being able to talk about the church without crying. I remember laying in bed on Mondays not wanting to get up, and just it was a very unhealthy time for me for sure. And so over the years, there have been times where emotionally I was just not in a healthy place, and it's difficult to lead when you're not emotionally healthy. And so through some of those times, especially really through what happened through the pandemic and stuff, the last few years, I've learned a few things about living from and leading from a healthy place. And so that's kind of what I was wanting to talk about, leading from a healthy place emotionally. And Max, talk to me about that. Have you ever been through times when you're kind of emotionally unhealthy?
Yeah, absolutely. I know in 2018, after I left the church, just feeling super burned out and just, man, that was my first 2 years in ministry, and I just definitely did not do it the way you should be doing ministry. I was just kind of burning at both ends, and I just remember being so busy and just so consumed with the ministry that I didn't give time for anything else in my life. And so when I left the church, I just remember just not really reading my Bible, just feeling super discouraged, just kind of secluding myself, not really hanging out with people. And again, I didn't realize it then, but I look back on it now. I'm like, I was definitely grieving a loss.
Yeah.
You know, I had never experienced such a loss in my life of just the community that I was around, the church, and even the calling I felt like I had on my life. I felt like I had walked away from all those things. It just felt super tough, and to some degree, I'm like, was I experiencing like a level of depression there? Like I don't know.
Yeah.
I never
Yeah.
diagnosed it in the moment, and so I don't really know. But yeah, I just was in such a dark place. Just wanted to stay in bed all day and just like not handle anything. And so when it comes to being physically unhealthy, I feel like I'm there right now. I feel like Thanksgiving is like around the corner.
Oh,
and, like,
here we
there's
go.
a feast just waiting to be happening. And so I'm just like, man, Thanksgiving is coming, and then Christmas cookies are happening in December. So, man, it's tough, Pastor.
Yeah, it is. While you were talking, because I think it came up, both of us talking about grief, I saw this quote just recently from C.S. Lewis that I'd never seen before, but I think it really explains what we were talking about there. Yeah. He says, so I just looked it up. He says, I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her real name was grief. Wow. And I thought, man, isn't that where we're at a lot of times? Anger, depression, discouragement, many times those things. And I know this is not a podcast about grief this time. We've done one. We've all been sad. So if you didn't listen to that one, go back and listen to that one. But I thought that we would say that just for a minute. Like maybe some people are experiencing like, hey, anger, frustration. Maybe it's just feelings of discouragement, even depression. In fact, depression is one of the stages of grief. A lot of times we can look at what are the things that we've lost in our life, and that can lead us to these places that are unhealthy. And then, it doesn't help when we sugar up at Christmas and Thanksgiving. And it's been Pastor Appreciation Month around here. We've had Tiff's
Monday,
treats
Tuesday,
like 3
Wednesday.
or 4 times, which thank you to all the people that sent us all the wonderful stuff. And then you guys I saw for
cookies.
youth, you had crumble cookie. I'm like, man, I'm trying to keep this weight off. I don't need any of that sugar, but impossible. I have enjoyed some of it. But I mean, I think we've all been in unhealthy places, physically, but also emotionally, spiritually. Some of that is because of grief, some of it because of disappointments. Some of it's because we don't process some of these things. And so what does it look like to live in a healthy way and to lead from a healthy perspective, from a healthy place? That's what our podcast is really about. It's about leadership and people who are in leaders. And that we've all been in those places where we're unhealthy, but I think we've all led from healthy places too. And so I got to thinking about this topic, and I was working on a talk that I got coming up next year, and I was thinking about this guy named Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And I thought, man, here's a guy who is a leader who led in a healthy way, led from a healthy place. In fact, I can't really find anywhere reading through his story where he was leading in an unhealthy way. All of his decisions, all the way that he led, came from a place that he led in a healthy way. He had just a strong emotional intelligence. He had a great self-awareness. He had a great prayer life. He displayed great empathy and compassion, but he never at the same time sacrificed his calling or his convictions. He was extremely resilient and courageous, even in spite of all the great opposition and the threats that he faced. He had confidence, but he also had humility. He found a way to keep a good life balance. There's some stuff in there about how he took the Sabbath and rested, which we'll talk about later in the series. And yet, even in that, he still was successful. He was healthy, but also successful in that he completed his task building the wall in 52 days. And so I just kind of broke down Nehemiah's life in this kind of talk, which kind of has turned into what this podcast is going to look at over the next few times that we are together. 4 kind of healthy things that Nehemiah had that we're going to have if we're going to be healthy in our leadership. Yeah. So I'll hit all of them, then we'll just start with the first one today for this first part. But he had a healthy posture. He had a healthy perspective. He had some healthy processes, and he had a healthy purpose. And so for this first one, I want to look at that Nehemiah postured himself in a healthy way. And because of that posture, he was able to lead from a healthy place. And so the first posture that I see when I look at Nehemiah's life is that he had a posture of prayer.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's one of the very first things that's mentioned with Nehemiah. You know, when you first read his story, and if you're not familiar with the story, you can go read it in Nehemiah chapter 1. But he gets this terrible news that the walls are broken down and in his hometown, and he's distraught about that. I mean, that would have definitely made the people of Israel be discouraged, and it kind of just made him feel disgraced. And so something rose up in Nehemiah that he needed to do something about it. But we see his first response in that is in Nehemiah 1 and verse 3. It says, "They said to me, things are not going well for those who return to the province of Judah. They are in great trouble and disgrace, and the wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. And when I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God in heaven." So he hears this news of stuff that's not going well. He wants to do something about it, but he comes at it from a healthy posture. He postures himself in prayer. That prayer is his first response to this calling that God puts on his life. We see it again in Nehemiah chapter 2. The king asked Nehemiah, why is he sad? And Nehemiah decides he's going to ask the king's blessing to go and rebuild the walls. But before he asks the king's blessing, what does he do? He does it again. He prays. In Nehemiah 2, verse 4, the king said to me, what is it that you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. And so there's example after example after example through the book of Nehemiah. His first posture is a posture of prayer. In fact, you count them up. In the book of Nehemiah, he prayed 14 different times in this one scenario. And there's only 13 chapters in Nehemiah. So, I mean, that's a lot of prayer in that one book and in that one story that we're learning about Nehemiah, that he was just always posturing himself in this way. That prayer, it was not just, how he responded, it was how he led. That's what he led with. It was his first resort, to posture himself in prayer.
Yeah, and I love that thought you just shared, that it's our first response. And I think so often people see prayer as a last response, and I've just seen so many occasions where people will just get to a place where they say, well, I guess all we can do now is pray. And it's like, man, that posture really sets you up for your prayers to fail and for your faith to shrink, and it's just such a, what if instead we flipped the script, and the first thing we did, regardless of the size of the situation or how dire the circumstances are, right? It could be as small as, I want to pass this test, to as big as, what's this report going to be from the doctor, and it just doesn't matter, but we just made it our first priority. We're just going to pray about it. And I need to train my mind to treat prayer as a trump card and not as a safety net, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm falling, I need to pray.
Yeah.
No, I see the situation, and I'm just going to open up with, God is able to do something here in this situation. So prayer isn't just something that we do for others, but I love that prayer does something for us, right? When I pray, it doesn't only change the circumstance that's in front of me, but it also changes the heart inside of me.
Yeah,
so.
that's so good. And I was even thinking, as you're saying, it doesn't say there in Nehemiah that he had a prayer life before this situation, but if he prayed like that in the middle of that situation, that just lets me know that this was a part of his life, a regular part of his life. If he prayed 13 times or 14 times in 13 chapters, it was just a part of his life. And so I think sometimes in leadership, prayer can be a response. And even if it can even be our first response, which it should be. But what if it was not just a response? What if it were just like, that's how we live? Yeah. It's like every day we're praying, because every day in leadership you're faced with situations. And so sometimes I think we can pray a whole lot more diligently and a whole lot harder when we're faced with big situations. But I am learning more to pray about every situation, and just, prayer's always been a part of my life, and I've always tried to pray regularly, almost daily. But I'm getting more and more and more focused in, and like making that a way that I live, and I'm praying for and about everything, and I just find myself being so much more healthy in my emotions. Because I'm posturing myself in prayer that's not going, man, I can handle this. It's going, no, I can't handle this, and I need God's help with that. So that was the first posture that I saw that Nehemiah had, was a posture of prayer. But then the second posture is right there in those first couple chapters also, and this is before he even starts building the wall, but he postures himself in submission. He is a person that was submitted to authority.
Come on.
And man, that's a healthy place. We did a whole podcast on that too a while back. So yeah, we've all been submitted. But I think it's a posture that is a healthy posture for us, that Nehemiah knew that God had given him an assignment, a calling, but he also put himself underneath the people that were there to lead him. He believed that the calling was from God, but he submitted that calling or that assignment to the people that were in authority over him. And so we see it in Nehemiah 2 and verse 1. The king said to me, "What is it that you want?" And then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where all my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild the wall." So it's interesting here that Nehemiah knows that God is calling him. So he's first of all submitted to God and to his calling, but he's then submitting his calling to the king, who is the one who is in authority over him. And so he doesn't just go to the king and go, "God called me to go, I'm going." He says, "No, if it pleases the king." In other words, he asks for permission. He understood authority. And I think that we can become unhealthy when we start to think that we don't have to answer to anyone else. And we start going, "Well, it's my calling, and this is what God's called me to do, and so I'm just going to go and do it." And I think a healthy posture is to understand God called me, but he's also put people in authority over me. So if he's spoken to me about what he's called me to do, he can also speak to them about what he's called me to do. They may even be able to help shape it. In fact, this is what happens with the king. The king then goes, "Well, hey, let me get you this guy and this guy to help you and get timber and this and that kind of stuff." And so because he was submitted to the king, he actually had more favor with the king, and the king was able to help him with the calling that God placed on him. And so I think we get unhealthy when we get prideful.
Yeah.
And we think, well, I don't have to answer to anybody else. This is what God wants me to do. But we got to remember what the Bible says: pride goes before the fall. And so there's a posture of going, in a healthy way. I'm saying I'm submitted to those in authority over me. And we said it when we talked about that, more recently, about being submitted. That doesn't mean we don't ask questions. Doesn't mean that we have to do something that goes against our values or whatever. But it means, hey, I'm surrendering myself not just to God's calling, but to the people he's put. I'm allowing there to be people that I am under, people that can say no to me. That's a healthy place to posture ourselves in.
Yeah. As you were talking about that first point, I thought about the MC Hammer.
MC.
Do you know what I'm thinking about?
No, tell me.
You got to pray just to make
it. Oh,
today.
That's right. You do. I didn't know you were young, old enough to remember that.
Come on. Man, this concept of being submitted, I think it's just so huge. I think it's so big. I know for myself, as still I consider myself as still a young leader, and having to be under someone's authority.
Mm-hmm.
Man, I've been super gracious, or I've been graced by great leaders in my life that I've just been able to submit to, and it's been like, man, it was a pleasure to be submitted under them, and because of that, I've received some blessing in that. But this idea is just so good, and I think people can say they're submitted until they have to use it, right? Until they actually have to submit to authority. And I just remember someone on my leadership team from back in the day who would constantly just say they wanted to be submitted to me. They wanted to be my armor bearer. They said those words, and I said that they wanted to learn from me. But the moment I challenged their thinking, I gave them some burden to shoulder, they proved they were just in it for their promotion, not for submission's sake, And I just challenge anyone listening today just to consider: are you submitted for what it gets you, or are you submitted for what it gives those you're submitted to? You know what I mean? There's a position of that. So.
Yeah, and it is like you said, it's easy to be submitted to someone that you agree with all the time, but it's a whole lot harder to submit when someone tells you no.
Yeah.
And oh man, what would have Nehemiah done if the king would have told him no? I don't know.
Yes.
Fortunately he didn't.
Yeah.
And I wonder even if Nehemiah had that favor with the king because he had lived a life in submission to the king.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so he had the king's trust and he had the king's favor, because this wasn't the first time that Nehemiah had submitted. Maybe even there were times when the king had told him no and Nehemiah had the right heart and the right attitude about it. So this time Nehemiah asked, he knew he could trust him because he knew he was submitted to him. And so, man, there's some rich depth in there for sure.
I think it's such an interesting concept, submission, especially in that kind of example. I know I've seen this in my life where you ask the question, right, of like, can I do this, or is it okay if I? And if you say that enough times and you have a track record of being obedient regardless of the answer, your question becomes it's no longer like a can I or can I not. It's like, this is what I want to do, but I'm asking you.
Yeah.
And because of your track record, they know what you want, right? So the king knew what Nehemiah wanted.
Yeah.
And so he was like, I know he wants this. So regardless of how I feel,
I'm
going to give it to him.
Well, even think about the relationship, because the king even sees that Nehemiah is down and asks, what's wrong? What's going on?
Yeah.
There had to have been that good relationship there, and a submitted relationship, which then leads I think this is the last one, right? The last posture here, and that is the posture of humility. That Nehemiah postured himself in a place of humility. We see that in verse 17 of Nehemiah 2. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall. Notice this part. He says, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. And I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. And so I was just thinking about this idea that Nehemiah didn't just think, I'm going to go do this thing by myself. He invited people to come along and be a part of it. And that shows a posture of humility. That shows to me that Nehemiah realized God had called him, but he wasn't the only one that God had called, and that he couldn't do it on his own. He was going to need help. He was going to have to grow. And so he postured himself in humility. He didn't just submit himself to the king, but then he invited other people to be a part of his team to go and get that done. And so I think that's a good place to posture. It's a healthy posture, is this posture of humility. It's this posture that says, I don't know it all.
Yeah.
I don't have it figured out. I'm going to need some help along the way. I'm going to have to grow along the way. And that's a great posture, a healthy posture to be in. In fact, one of my favorite quotes, I've used it many, many times, but I love it. It says, the greatest hindrance to discovery is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. Yeah. And what that means to me is that so often the thing that holds us back from learning and growing and getting to where we need to be is not that we're dumb. It's just that we think we know it already. And so it's not what I think it's not what we don't know that holds us back. It's what we think we already know that holds us back. And so sometimes we got to humble ourselves and go, I don't know, and I can't do it all by myself, and I do need help, and I do need other people to be a part of what God is doing. It's like John Wooden said. He said, it's what you learn after you know it all that really counts. In fact, James says it like this in James 1, verse 19. He says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word that is planted in you, which can save you. I like what James says. He says, here's the thing that's going to save you. Here's the thing that's going to save you in leadership, okay? Yeah. Here's the thing that's going to keep you in a healthy place. Here's the thing that's going to keep you from becoming unhealthy, and that is this: when we are willing to be quiet and listen. When we're willing to understand, okay, I don't know it all. Yeah. In fact, I was just listening to Craig Rochelle right as we're coming back from lunch on his little podcast, and he said something about, if you're talking, you're not learning. Yeah. And that's so true. I know there are times when I'm talking things out and I'm processing, and so it helps me to get clarity, but I'm not learning anything new if I'm talking. Yeah. I'm only learning if I'm listening. And so I think the thing that saves us is when we humbly accept the word that is planted in us, when we're slow to speak, when we're quick to listen. Yeah. Then what it does is it makes us slow to become angry or unhealthy, right? Yeah. And we're able to accept what God is speaking to us through his word, through other people, or whatever. And so I just wrote down in my notes, how do you know if you are in a humble posture? How do you know? I think the way you know is you look at how you respond to feedback.
Yeah.
Like when someone tries to give you feedback, are you defensive? Man, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. Why are they telling me that or whatever? Or are you receptive?
Yeah.
Humbly accepting the word that is planted in you. And so I think that's a good sign to be able to go, hey, am I healthy? Am I living from a humble posture? How am I responding when someone tries to give me feedback? Am I defensive about it or am I receiving it?
Yeah.
The humble place is when I'm open and I'm going, man, I don't know it all. And I'm quick to listen and I'm slow to speak and slow to become angry, and I'm humbly accepting the word of God that's planted in me because I'm coming from a humble posture.
Yeah. I recently asked some of our leaders what their values are, and I shared one of my values is, and that's to be teachable. I have a motto that I want to be a learner for life, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how old I am, I just always want to keep learning until the day that I die. And I think people often get too cocky. They think they're good enough, right? They feel like they reach a certain level of leadership and they're like, I'm good. I got it handled. I can start teaching people, right? And I don't have to learn anymore. They rely on their talents and their abilities, and they fail to let somebody challenge them, right? That positive feedback, even if it's constructive criticism or destructive criticism, that they're allowing people to speak into their lives, and they don't allow themselves to grow into maturity that God really wants for them, right? That all that God wants us to be can really come from the people above us and around us, that want to teach us. And so when it comes to being teachable, I think we have to understand it in 4 layers of knowledge. One, I think there are things that you don't know that you don't know.
Yeah.
There are things you don't know that you don't know. And I think that's just immaturity, right?
Yeah.
So like we're growing in our maturity, right? Right now, there are things that I have not experienced because I'm not a dad, right?
Yeah.
There are things that you know because you've experienced them, right?
And you don't even know you don't know them.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't know until I experience it. And so second thing is there are things you think you know, but you don't know everything about, right? And I think that's just mastery, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm a youth pastor right now, and I feel like I'm growing and learning about youth pastor things, but I haven't mastered being a youth pastor, right?
Yeah.
So the things
You'd be the master pastor when you get that.
The third layer of knowledge is there are things you know that you know, right? This is like the things that you truly believe. Like I have spent time in the Word since I've become a Christian, and like that's something I firmly believe in, right? It's become knowledge, and then from knowledge it became belief. Like I am strongly confident that Jesus died and rose again, that he was resurrected, and that's what I put my faith in, right? It's an anchor for me. The fourth thing is there are things you know that you don't know, right? And so there's just an awareness, right? There's an awareness to go like, there are things about being a lead pastor that I don't know, right?
Yeah.
But I know I don't know those things because I've never been in your position. And so I think those are 4 layers that we can think about and we can kind of categorize in our life to go, where do I need to grow, right? There are things I don't know that I need to start learning, right? There are things that I know that I could be better about. And there are things that I'm confident about that I can talk about, right?
Yeah. And then on that last one, where you said there's things that I know that I don't know, I know this is going to start sounding like a tongue twister, but I think the more you know that there are lots of things you don't know.
Yes, absolutely.
I think when you're at that first stage, that stage of immaturity, you do kind of think, well, I do know, and you don't really know what you don't know.
Yep.
But as you mature more and as you grow more, you have deeper beliefs and you have deeper confidence in the things you do know. Also, the more humility you have that says, wow, if it's taken me this long to learn this much, how much more out there is there that I don't know as well? And so the more you know, the more aware you become of all the things that you don't know, which then turns around and leads more into humility.
Yes.
But also the more you know what you do know, the beliefs that you have, the more confidence that you have. And so there's that dichotomy again, which we talked about on the podcast before, how confidence and humility, they run hand in hand with one another, because the more that I know, the more I know I don't know, and that's humility. But the more I know what I do know, the more confident I am in that, and both of those can walk together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think for me, what my posture of humility looks like as we kind of wrap this point up is just I'll never know everything, but I will spend my life learning as much as I can for as long as I can from as many people as I can.
That's good.
That I'd be
man.
willing
I
to
like
look
that.
at anyone around me, younger or older, right? Wiser or not as wise, but just be willing to listen, right? Being slow to speak and quick to listen to
Yeah,
them. So
I think that, man, that's such a great posture. That's a healthy posture to be someone that goes, man, I'm willing to spend my life learning for as long as I can from as many people as I can.
yeah,
And that is humility, because humility says, I don't care if you're younger, you're older, if your ministry is bigger than mine or smaller than mine, I can learn something from everybody.
yes, absolutely.
And that's a healthy place to be. And so that's where Nehemiah was. He was teachable, like you said. I remember reading a book a few years ago by a guy named Matthew. I can't remember his last name, but anyway, great Matthew Keller, and it was called The Key to Everything.
Yeah.
And so you're like, oh, what's the key to
Ooh,
everything?
yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to know the key to everything.
Yeah.
And the key to everything was teachability. He was just talking
Okay.
about if you
That's awesome.
can be teachable, then you can learn anything.
Yeah.
But if you don't have this posture, then you can't. And so that's where Nehemiah was. He postured himself in a healthy way. He was postured in prayer. He was posture. I mean, even that posture of prayer comes from a posture of humility, because they all work together here.
Yeah.
Because he had this humility that said, I can't do it, so I need God's help. So he started with prayer. He led with prayer. He lived his life with prayer. He postured himself in that way. He postured himself in submission.
Yeah.
I think submission also comes down to humility.
Yeah.
It goes, hey, I know what I can do, but I also know who's in authority over me, and so I'm humbling myself before them. And so then humility, this posture of humility, I'm teachable, which I think humility might be one of the keys to everything, really, because it's the key to posturing yourself in prayer. It's the key to posturing yourself in under authority and in submission. And so just powerful stuff, man. And they were only in the second chapter of Nehemiah, and only in that first posture that he finds himself in. But, man, there's some rich stuff about how to be healthy in our leadership.
Yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much all we got for today. You got anything else, Pastor?
I don't think so. This was good, man. Yeah. So, hey, thanks everybody for joining us. Always have fun doing the We've All Been There podcast. Thanks, Max, for being a fantastic host. And we encourage you to just share this with your friends. Like it, subscribe, do all the stuff on there. Give us a comment so we can get more of these out to the people that can hear about We've All Been There and how we can be healthy. So we'll see you next time.